Thank you, Jim. Ravi, what is your view?
Actually, it's pretty similar. I'd say if you look at, I think it'd be actually interesting to see what the definition of an SBC is. Generally speaking, the way we define it is to exclude those kinds of routing functions. We actually have two products, the SBC and the MSX. The MSX does include routing functions that support things like LCR. If you look at the kinds of deployments we do, we have customers that use an SBC with a gateway, sort of gatekeeper, an enum server, a SIP redirect server. Those are the generally the classes of deployments out there. And essentially in all those cases, we've offloaded the routing logic or the database elsewhere. Now, there's obviously hybrid models where the SBC is required to do, for example, call hunting based on a set of records that comes back from the enum server. That's pretty common. That seems to be picking up steam. So there's no doubt that the SBC needs to be pretty intelligent in the way it does make decisions, but it doesn't need to store, for example, the SCL routing table. It doesn't. I don't believe SBC should do that. I don't think that's the definition of SBC. Also, if you look at the way the industry is evolving with IMS architectures like the IPCF, that's a fairly dumb device. It's essentially, even a subset of an SBC, I'd argue, where it doesn't include some of the functions that SBCs have built up that's important, such as normalization or security. So I think there's a great argument to be made for separation. Also, I think carriers have legacy systems that they need to, move forward. And a lot of that has to do with routing logic. So SBCs shouldn't displace that, or certainly don't need to displace that. It doesn't make much sense. We should be able to integrate with what's there.
Thank you, Ravi. Dalton?
Okay, first of all, thank you, Stephane, for referring to the SBC as a highly powerful device. I'd also like to refer back to Jim's comment about a huge box, and I don't want to necessarily equate that to a highly powerful device. So size doesn't necessarily equate to intelligence and session border control, but Acme Packet definitely believes in a stateful edge to the network, and I think the amount of routing intelligence that you'd like to locate at that stateful edge really does, to some degree, depend upon your scaling requirements, your reachability, your accessibility, your requirement for a very large-scale database. Really, we propose a layered architecture that really starts with that stateless database layer, and we know how to build stateless, large, scalable databases. TransNexus is a perfect example of that type of capability. But then, as you go down the layers into that network, and you reach a highly stateful edge, and a highly stateful edge can be a session border controller, or it could be, if you look at a stateful gateway, essentially a soft switch, class 5 equivalent soft switching environment, could be seen as a highly stateful edge. So somewhere there between that stateless database layer and the stateful edge, you do have a question of reachability and the associated network state that goes along with that reachability. For example, you look up in a routing database of a very large number of routes, millions, you may end up with dozens of next hops. So you certainly wouldn't want to then go back to a stateless hunt and search capability. You need to maintain the user experience. You need to reflect that routability information back in the session border controller. So really that stateless routing layer, maybe a session routing layer between the semi-stateful and a highly stateful session border controller layer can work together with different elements of that routing intelligence. There's also the question of topology hiding, right? So the session border controller may have a little more information about next hops or the horizon of the network than the database would have, and you wouldn't necessarily want to reflect all the potential next hops in the routing database as well. So that can work out to help you scale your network so that you may have a distributed star that starts with some stateless database, some additional reachability information in the middle, and then it fans out at the session border controller. So they all work together.
And Glen?
Great. Thank you. I appreciate the chance to be here. I would certainly agree that the relatively non-routing SBC at the edge makes a lot of sense in some networks, and I think it's important to really step back and consider all that that system does sitting there, even though it's not doing routing on a DNS basis. It does, like Don mentioned, the topology hiding. It does the emission control, security, stateful failovers, things like that. That it does a large amount of processing of those calls so that you can then abstract the routing into a stateless type of DB lookup that might come back with a 302 redirect or something along those lines. So even though we're talking about the routing per se, that the non-routed SBCs still provide a huge amount of value for any given network. That being said, I think there are many networks where having a routing decision made on a DNS and a HANI makes a lot of sense, and it does depend more or less on the architecture of the services, whether it's needs to do LNP lookups or CNAME lookups, or even like a prepaid check, which a lot of networks still run on prepaid calling card type of applications, which used to be done in an SCP, but now it can be done in an SBC with radius or diameter interfaces.
Okay, so basically it really depends on the architecture of the network sitting there. But what about, if a network is being built from scratch?
Well, then you have to look at, okay, is it a retail application where you have a number of class 5 servers and all you really have to do is direct a few DIDs to the appropriate feature server? I think in a lot of retail networks you may have such a simplistic routing mechanism, and it doesn't make sense to do it anywhere else. You have retail applications tend to be very focused on number of subscribers, what the features are that the subscribers can reach, the revenue targets and things like that, rather sort of a top line concern rather than a bottom line concern about least cost routing. Certainly, like Jim mentioned, if you're in a wholesale environment where you have to route on NPA NXXX, do an ANI and DNS toll call comparison, that becomes a very complicated routing scheme. But for a lot of the larger retail people, they don't really care that much about their bottom line. They're saying, I'm going to take the call from my subscriber, I'm going to give it the level 3 quest, global crossing, I'm done with my routing. So it very much depends on the nature of the applications or the customers.
Yeah. So basically that goes back to what I was saying at the beginning, by mentioning large service providers talking to the long-distance international guys who do care about as opposed to the domestic guys who don't really care. Do we have any views from the audience? Questions? Yes.
When we talk about routing, if we even consider the case where it's not just an extermination, but rather trying to reach plethora of devices of the user, and then you have a release, and then you continue the routing. So it's not mere a lookup or a translation to find the next hop, but rather it continues throughout the lifetime of that particular user initiation. So when you talk about that, does it give a much more clearer guideline where the routing should be, or?
I think in that case, that's more or less a class 5 type application where you're talking about a roaming subscriber and forwarding phone calls back and forth from a particular device.
Not necessarily class 5. I mean, even traditionally you've seen where you have access standards. Somebody described SBC being viewed as an access standard. I mean, you can have traditional switch where you have all the VRs and all that. You go to all the trunk groups and then they are not available, whatever. Circuit's not available, the network is busy, and then you reroute. Now the intelligence, when you're rerouting, it has to be stateful, things like that. So does it say then, well, it doesn't really fit into SBC, but rather it has to fit into some of the stateful engines, because things like that.
I think this goes back to, maybe the model here is that you have a stateless database or a stateless device.